Hi, everybody. This is an intro to assignment 4.0 and 4.5, which will be the 2-week assignment covering portfolio. So this assignment is one that takes a little extra time and is especially important because the portfolio is the document that ultimately you'll be using to apply for co-op jobs. But also in the future, it's sort of the most important document that you can work on in your academic career, as this not only gets you jobs, but also will ultimately be the thing that determines whether you get into grad school or not, and then eventually whether you get good scholarships or not, as oftentimes grad schools will pay for the best students who have the best portfolios, and it's really a portfolio-driven process. So it's really important to try to make your portfolio as strong as it can be. It is a vehicle to show you work, but it's also, it itself is a composition. If I were to view a portfolio that is a really well-made portfolio but doesn't have particularly good work, or a portfolio that has good work but isn't a particularly good portfolio, I'm probably going to favor the one with the better portfolio because it's going to show off the work better, even though the other portfolio might have better work. So it's good to think of this document that you're creating as a project, a work itself. It is not just a collection of images. If all we needed to do was make a collection of images, we would just send a Google Doc folder with all the images of the projects we've worked on. But that's not what a portfolio is. It's a organized document that shows your work and shows how you can compose your work, talk about your work, even when you're not there. Most of the time in studio, you get to defend your work. If someone asks a question, why did you make this decision or that decision? You get to come in and say, oh, I did this, or I was thinking about that. With a portfolio, you have none of that ability. You have to rely purely on your graphical skills, your writing, and just the general presentation in order to convey the information when you're not there to talk about it. And that's why minor things like errors and typos and omissions can be really problematic and something to really avoid. I highly recommend, while you're creating this portfolio, getting in as many people as you can possibly to help review it. That means your studio faculty. That means getting GAs, upperclassmen. It even means getting your parents to come and take a look at it, because they might be able to view it from someone who maybe doesn't have an architectural background, but they also might be able to find some of your spelling errors or typos or things that just don't make sense to them. So getting a wide variety of people to look at your portfolio is only going to benefit you. So a few of the specifics. The best tool to create portfolios is going to be InDesign. InDesign is required for this course, and I would strongly recommend not using something like Word. You just don't have the graphical control that you do with a graphic design focused software like InDesign. Whenever possible, this should be a document that is well organized. So we're going to cover grids and how to make them in InDesign, but you want to sort of keep things consistent, page to page, spread to spread, so that people can not get jostled around visually as they turn from page to page in your portfolio. Each page or spread, which we'll talk about the difference, should itself be a balanced visual composition. And that means it shouldn't have too much white space, too little white space. It shouldn't have one large image. Well, sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. We'll talk about what are good examples of composition and what aren't. Since we are making this with the co-op in mind, there's a few things we have to keep in mind specifically for that, which is that co-op requires a portfolio that is no larger than 5 megabytes to be uploaded to the PAL website. You can have other versions of the portfolio, and I highly, highly recommend that you do, that you can share through various sites such as Issue or the Adobe portfolio sharing site, that co-ops can view, your co-op employers can view, and will be much higher quality. 5 megabytes is an incredibly small file size when you're going to have multiple pages. And it's very difficult to get your portfolio to look really good under 5 megabytes. So you want to get that thing produced, but also have a high quality version that you can send out. My typical recommendation is, when making a portfolio, there's sort of 3 different standards of quality that you should be exporting to. The first is print quality. This is the highest quality portfolio that you could send to a professional printer and would come out beautiful on a page with no quality issues whatsoever. For that, you are looking to aim for 300 DPI or dots per inch with the maximum quality compression. Typically, those are going to be over 50 megabyte files. I've seen them be 100 megabyte or even greater. That's not uncommon, and that's not a problem. The next is sharing quality. So this may be if a co-op says, hey, could you email me your portfolio? I just want to have a copy of it. You don't want to email that print quality one because they see a 150 megabyte file, that's not going to look great for you. And they may never download, may not even be able to email, you may not be able to share it very easily. For sharing quality, I recommend the sort of 20 to 30 megabyte range, knowing that not all emails can even send that, but it's a good range that you can get a good sort of mix of quality without the file size being too large. For this, I typically recommend 200 DPI as your export setting and high quality compression. Lastly, we have the co-op PAL standard. This is, again, going to be the hardest one to achieve because of how incredibly low the settings have to be to get 5 megabytes to work. I typically start with suggesting 150 DPI at medium or high compression, but for most of you, that won't be enough. And we'll have to cut out more, lowering that DPI number because that directly impacts how large your file size is. There are some other things to be aware of. So in InDesign, you can link in multiple different file types. You can link in your JPEGs, your TIFFs, your Photoshop files, your vectors, your Illustrator files, CAD, maybe CAD, lots of different things. Anything that is raster based, meaning Photoshop or JPEGs or TIFFs, all of that can be compressed. So that will be directly affected by that 150 DPI number. If it is straight out of Illustrator or Rhino, or is a PDF that has vector files, meaning they are lines that you can zoom into infinitely, those, although typically smaller in file size, can be problematic. So the image that you see on the screen right now, actually, it's a page from my portfolio that I made in grad school. In the upper right-hand corner, there's an image of a city in Cincinnati. Because that is a whole bunch of data, that image alone could be enormous. It has all this really fine-grained detail of topography lines, of street lines, of buildings. And because it's a vector file, that actually can't be compressed. The file size that exists and the number of data points you need to construct all those lines and hatches and fills doesn't change if you do compression. So if that file I linked in, say it was an Illustrator file that was 50 megabytes, and you look into your portfolio will be 50 megabytes plus whatever else you have. Those cannot be compressed. Now, a way around it is to go from Illustrator and to export a JPEG, a PNG, something that is a raster file that you can bring into InDesign, and then it can be compressed. That is a great way around it, but I don't exclusively say you shouldn't do vector files because they can also, on the other end of things, be significantly smaller. If you have built them correctly and they're sort of a managed number of points, they can actually show a lot more information than a raster file can for the same file size. So they're not inherently bad, but they are a problem area that if you're starting to have trouble trying to figure out why your PDF isn't small enough, oftentimes look to your raster files. And I will show you in InDesign how to figure out what everything is that's linked. From my understanding, you guys have all used InDesign to a certain extent. InDesign, Photoshop, and Illustrator are the Adobe sort of core suite that we use. Each of them have their own purpose. Photoshop is really great at not only photo editing, as the name implies, but also just general raster manipulation. Raster images being images of sort of dots on the screen. Illustrator is Adobe's best software to edit vectors and is a great way to have strong control over vector images. Not so great for drafting per se, but editing and have really tight control over the graphics of vector images, Illustrator is a great option. InDesign is basically for creating portfolios, for multi-page documents, for Larger images, such as if you're doing a poster or something where you're combining multiple images. It's great because it combines things into one single place, keeps them organized for you, and allows you to essentially edit text that goes with it, have hundreds of different files linked in and linked together without it being so cumbersome and difficult to work with. Portfolios range in number of pages fairly dramatically. I would definitely encourage you to not go to the extreme ends. I don't know if your co-op department has necessarily given you a recommendation. Mine is probably in the 10 to 20 page range. Certainly, I've seen portfolios that are successful on either end of that. I've seen in a lot of portfolios go up to 40 pages or 50 pages. The problem is you only have 5 megabytes to get to, and it's going to be harder with the more pages you add in. But also, with the amount of work you have right now, where you are in your education, it's hard to justify having 40 pages. And with a sort of digital-only presentation that you're likely going to be doing with your co-op employers, they will not likely get to the end of your portfolio. The way people read digital documents is they begin in the beginning and they go through page by page. That's not actually how people typically read a portfolio that's printed. You actually, if you pick up a book, it tends to open to the middle spread. So actually in a printed format, the middle spread is often your most important page, whereas a digital format, your beginning images are your most important pages. So there are some inherent differences between printing and viewing a document as a print document and viewing a document as digital. But if you have a 50, 60, 70 page portfolio, I can almost guarantee you most of the employers who'll be looking at it are going to get bored before they get to the end, and they won't read the whole thing. You want them reading the whole thing because you want them getting the best picture of you possible and not missing some information that's 20 pages later that they won't get to. A lot of employers are going to be reviewing 5, 10, 15 portfolios at a time, some from UC, some from other schools as well. And they don't necessarily have time to go through 70 pages per student. So try as best you can to be concise with your work. At the same time, you don't want to put every single image on a single page. It will be illegible and just generally not look very good and probably not be a great composition. So there's certainly a balance you have to find. Anyways, so this is the assignment. What you guys will submit is essentially we have a draft deadline, which is going to be Thursday, September 22nd. And basically, you'll just need to submit a PDF of wherever you are at that point. And we'll be doing reviews with you. Hopefully, throughout this process, you'll be able to get some one-on-one time with your GA to actually talk about your specific portfolio. But we'll have a draft due on September 22nd. And the 25th, we will have the final portfolio due. This is the same day for your co-op, so you will be submitting both at the same time. This will be midnight for us. So it's the one time we're not going to have it due during class. Over that weekend, you will have no assignment from us. You will have no skills. You get the weekend of the 25th off, but you do have to get it in by Friday, 25th at midnight. And what I'd like you guys to submit is a sharing quality PDF, which is going to be in that 200 DPI-ish, 20 to 30 megabyte range. And then a co-op PAL standard PDF, which just needs to be under 5 megabytes, however you can get there. Again, those are my starting settings. They probably aren't going to get it smaller enough for you, but it's a starting point. The best thing you can do initially is start lowering that number, the 150 DPI. There's a couple things to consider here. So your typical screen ranges in resolution and DPI. Typical screen is like usually around 110 to 115 dots per inch, or somewhere in that general range. So as long as you're not below that number, it's not going to already look blurry. As soon as you start going below that number on most screens, the images are going to look blurry inherently. By being larger than that number, you allow for your people viewing your PDF to actually be able to zoom in a little bit without losing quality. And that's why 300 is great. Again, it's crazy high, don't need it. But if you have it at 300, people can zoom in significantly and be able to legibly read your images and text. Okay, so having said that, we're going to move on. So, one thing you might have noticed is all of the assignment sheets I've made have a lot of things in common with each other. They have the same exact format, very consistent typing, very consistent spacing. And that's because I build these assignment sheets the same way I would build a portfolio using InDesign and using exactly the same tools and principles that I would use in InDesign. So I'm going to talk about a few portfolios. The first one I will talk about is actually my own. One that I made in grad school, so it's a little bit old at this point. However, it is full of academic work and is, I'd say, still fairly successful. This is, of course, also in InDesign. This portfolio is 56 pages, which is definitely on the long side, but also consider this was in grad school when I had 4 years of undergrad, a couple years of grad school, a lot more projects at that point, so a lot more content to get in. So that's why it ended up being as long as it did. By the way, since I am in InDesign, I will mention a few things along the way. I just hit Shift-W to make it go full screen, so that's a little trick. The cover. Every portfolio has to have a cover in some way, shape, or form. There's lots of different ways to do a cover, and there's lots of correct and incorrect answers. When I designed this, which I actually designed this cover even before grad school and undergrad, my thought was to be sort of maximalist with the cover, meaning I wanted it to be, if someone had a print copy of this and it was sitting on their desk, I wanted it to be so loud and visually obnoxious with color that someone would want to or have to pick it up to see what was in it. I don't necessarily believe that philosophy anymore, but it's still the cover I have because I haven't changed it and haven't updated my portfolio since I was in grad school. So here's the one that I have. What's important on your cover? Biggest thing is your name. There are other things you can include as well. University, the type of degree you're getting, whether it's architecture and interior design, sometimes a phone number or email, but minimum your name, of course. The next, I've always preferred to jump straight in and include a resume. Again, this resume is a bit old at this point, but you can get the point. Oftentimes, you're going to be submitting a resume separately, but you can't guarantee that an employer is necessarily going to be holding a resume in one hand and looking in your portfolio in the other. So I like to include it just as a reminder on the first page. Keeping a resume legible and graphically easy to read is going to be extremely important. So my general recommendation is that you should have several different weights of typeface that you're using, and essentially set up a key that you describe projects or employers or instruction or experiences with. So in this case, you see this employer, which is Perkins and Will, is in a heavier font. It has it's a bit bold. The next thing down is the location and the general time frame in which it happened. Next, a incredibly brief single sentence description of what you did. This applies for whether it's an architectural office or whether it's a summer job you had or something in high school. It's good to give just a little bit of information. So each of these has sort of 3 levels: the name, the location and time frame, and a brief description of what actually happened there. And the same thing applies for all of these. It's the same for experiences, programs, anything you have. Of course, including your name repeatedly is always a good idea. You don't want them to forget who you are or have trouble figuring out, who's this portfolio again? Next up, so this jumps into a project. So in this case, this is actually my thesis project from grad school. It's good to have some sort of introductory image. It doesn't have to be necessarily a full cover page. My portfolio is set up in spreads, which means it's meant to have 2 different pages next to each other that would fold together if this were printed. And I still intend for people to view it like that, whether they view it digitally or printed. If you are setting up in spreads, there's a few things you have to be aware of. Mostly that you don't want to have things on the center line, because if you were to think about it, if it was printed as a book, that would be in the binding and no one would be able to see it. However, since you are predominantly just going to be doing digital submission, you can set it up as a single image per page as opposed to doing spreads. Either are options. I am fine with you doing either. I think there's validity to doing both. I'm used to working in spreads, so that's the way I'm going to continue working. For each project, it's good to introduce the project, a bit of information and a time frame, and in this case, a brief description of what it is. I like to start with some kind of evocative image, even if I don't think anyone knows what this image means, and doesn't really matter. It's kind of evocative, and that's all that really matters. And then start to go into something a little bit more informative. The next page, which is the page that's on the cover of that assignment sheet, this is sort of a good example of levels of information. So we have one large image on the right that takes up an entire half the page or entire page or half the spread with a lot of information, very dense. It kind of justifies being as big as it is because of how much density of information it has. Next, we have a sort of medium image at the top that has a few things called out on it. It's got some color, predominantly black and white. It's sort of a medium level information. And at the bottom, we have a series of smaller images that sort of support everything else and some text that goes in between. Notice also that every image has a single title or bit of text with it. I'm going to actually go ahead and turn off the camera so that you can see the full page, because I realize that you probably won't be able to do that. And I try to hide as much as possible. I'll get rid of the keyboard, but maybe include the captioning. So give me 1 second. Okay, so hopefully that's a little bit easier. I realize it's still going to cover some things, but I'm trying to find a way to do this as best as I can. Anyways, so 3 different sort of scales of images with 3 different levels of information. That's in general a solid strategy for any portfolio page / spread. 1 large image, 2 sort of medium images, or 1 medium image that sort of has sort of a lesser amount of information, and then a smaller supporting series of images. So we'll go down to the next page. The occasional full spread, again with some text here. Again, really evocative image, lots of smoke. This is one I showed recently in a demo. But again, some more text. Again, to the next page, lots of really tiny supporting images, some medium images and some larger renders. Again, text. Again, titles with each one of these, giving a little bit more description. This page is probably the least well organized of any of them as part of this project, as there's almost a little bit too much information going on here. And ending with a sort of another larger image. So this project begins with an intro page that is full bleed on both pages, or the full spread. Of course, name, a graduate studio, independent studio project, fall 2012. Another full bleed image with some more description, and a model shot with a bunch of supporting images. Again, lots of text describing things, some interior rendering, plans, as well as an elevation of the project. That section on the right is a sort of detail construction section. But again, sort of a balance of information here. Plans can be incredibly challenging to include as part of a portfolio, primarily because usually they're quite small. So making them legible that someone could actually read them when they're on a page like this, it can be a real challenge. Some more work. I think I'm just going to kind of go through these a little quicker now. Since I do have this in InDesign, of course, unlike a PDF, it will move a little slower. So you can see here, there's a little loading bar at the bottom. InDesign is referencing the full-scale images as opposed to a PDF, which has smaller images. But this should be almost unloading. And so my InDesign is actually crashed at this point. That is the consequence of large file size, and I think I might have something corrupted at this point from a very old file. So I'm actually going to end this little demo here and do a second video, which is just going through a bunch of different portfolios, including my own, in a second video. So tune into that one next.